Today, we're going to be talking about what one could consider the most extraordinary evening in the history of the university. It is an event that came to be known as the Siege of Carr's Hill, and it is an event that I played a major role in preventing the president's mansion from being burned down. So let's get in the time machine and travel back 5 decades to the spring of 1970. It was the end of my 4th year. It was at a time when the university had been in the midst of transforming events, the civil rights movement, and in my last year, starting in 1969, the Vietnam anti-war movement finally hit big time. And in the fall of 1969, there had been many demonstrations, and the grounds became totally politicized for the first time in memory. And it was a very difficult period that divided the university in a way probably it had never been divided before. Well, things had seemed to have calmed down in the spring until the Cambodia intrusion of late April 1970, when suddenly all the anti-war rallies started again. And what made it worse was an event that occurred just a few days later, which was the horrible deaths of the students at Kent State. And the Kent State massacre really riled up the student body in a way that it had never been before. Meanwhile, in one of those amazing coincidences of history, weeks and weeks before, an event had been scheduled to take place. And that event was a speech at University Hall by 2 of the main leaders of the anti-war movement in the US, and that was Bill Kunstler and Jerry Rubin. And for those of you who have seen the highly touted new movie, The Trial of the Chicago 7, you will recognize those names. So in what was already a tense atmosphere with the flames growing, that speech would be the fuel to those flames. So that evening, I marched over to U-Haul. It was an event I did not intend to miss. And as I got into U-Haul, the first thing that struck me was the odor of weed wafting up from the stands. And there weren't only students there were a lot of outsiders there. It was packed. It was standing room only. And as the speakers began, I started to feel that this was not going to end well. The speakers were there to call the students to action. So you had Kunstler, who was a very bright, very serious guy, tremendous speaker, and Rubin, who was really more of a showman, but he'd be prancing around the stage, calling for the students to rise up and to do something. So here we were, listening to those two, the crowd being whipped into a frenzy. Well, when Kunstler and Rubin were done, they said, on to action, on to action. And someone in the front of the crowd screamed, on to Carr's Hill. And people started getting up and running out. There was very little security evident, never saw policemen. The only security were some student marshals, mostly graduate students. And one of them who knew me ran up to me and said, will you come up to Carr's Hill with me? I think there could be some bad stuff happening. So I went with him. We both sprinted up to Carr's Hill. And that was at a time when I could still sprint about a mile. And we got up there, and I was surprised to find about 30 people at most there. I thought there would be a lot more. And we looked around, we looked at each other. Fortunately, there were a number of varsity athletes there, so at least we would have some type of a presence. And then we looked back at U-Haul. And even though it was springtime and the foliage was in bloom, we could see through the leaves of the trees the torches snaking their way from U-Haul up to Carr's Hill. And that's what it was. It was a torch-lit march. And we stood there and watched as hundreds and hundreds we could perceive beyond the leaves coming towards us. And then when they got at the foot of the hill, we could see that it was more than just a few hundred. It was probably up to 1,000 students and others there. Well, we looked at each other. We were very concerned because at that time, the president of the university was Edgar Shannon, and he had a number of young children who we believed were in the mansion at the time. So one person in the crowd said, we need to do something. And then another said, what we need to do is to lock arms and form a chain around the front of the building, which is what we did. We formed the chain curving around the front, with the center of the chain being on the walkway leading up to the mansion. And as we were doing this, the crowd was moving up the steps to Carr's Hill. And then they got about 10, 15 feet away from us and stopped. And meanwhile, you had Kunstler in the crowd with a bullhorn, just stirring the pot and trying to create as much of a frenzy as he could in the crowd. And when they approached us, we just stood there and we stared down each other. And then I can't remember who it was in our group, but it was someone standing right in the middle, went up to their leadership group and said, look, the president's family is in there. He has a number of small children. I think you're really frightening them very much. It would be in everybody's interest for you to go elsewhere tonight before something really bad happens. And he came back to us and we stood staring at them, and everybody I can remember tensed up. I could feel our arms locked. Everybody was tensed. And it's funny, in fact, a number of decades later, a faculty member who knew I had been there said during an event we were at, hey, do you still have the bruises on your arms from locking arms up at Carr's Hill? Well, we stared at each other, and then finally someone in their group said, on to Maury Hall. And the group turned and left and marched over to Maury Hall, which at that time was the headquarters of the Navy ROTC and had been the attack point days before by some demonstrations. Well, we all heaved a sigh of relief, and the group did in fact go over to Maury Hall. And that night, in fact, they did try to burn down Maury Hall. When the police dispersed the crowd over there, they found burning mattresses in the basement of Maury Hall. So that was an incredible evening, and one that I remember like it was yesterday. But it's also an evening that resonates with what is going on, I believe, today on grounds and in many college campuses, where these campuses have become politicized and where people's agendas, political and social agendas, have taken precedence over collegiality, community, and camaraderie. And I think it's so important today that we understand that people of goodwill and intelligent people aren't necessarily going to agree with everything we believe in, but that we in the community hopefully have more in common than the differences we have. And that it's worth all our whiles to be civil with each other and to listen to our friends and colleagues, because that's what we're here for, I think, at a university, aren't we? We're here to hear different points of view and hopefully find common ground, but even when we don't, to respect our friends and our colleagues. Thanks.